On January 14, 2024, a campus emergency call set in motion an investigation that would culminate in a high-profile criminal trial, significant media attention, and a sentencing hearing in early December 2025. The factual record established during indictment, trial, and sentencing proceedings reflects a sequence of events in which an 18-month-old child was discovered unresponsive in a dormitory setting, life-saving measures were undertaken at Phoebe Sumter Hospital, and law enforcement secured statements and physical evidence that formed the basis for multiple felony charges. The matter received sustained regional and national reporting.
Killed that little boy. She killed that little boy. She cracked his skull.
Well, the state still doesn't know how it happened, where it happened, why it happened, who it happened, or even with what was used for it happened.
We, the jury, find the defendant not guilty on counts 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. The verdict reads, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty.
And the docket ultimately reflected charges that included counts of malice murder, 2 counts of felony murder, 2 counts of aggravated battery, and first-degree cruelty to children. The jury returned mixed findings, acquitting on 1 count while convicting on 5 others. And the court subsequently imposed a custodial sentence that will be the subject of appellate procedures. Available under Georgia law. The record available through court filings, prosecutor statements, and contemporaneous reporting frames the case as both a criminal prosecution and a contested evidentiary inquiry into causation, intent, and the sufficiency of competing factual narratives. The principal defendant, identified publicly as Trinity Poague, was during the time frame in question a student at Georgia Southwestern State University and a title holder in a local pageant circuit, designated Miss Donelsonville in reporting, and the prosecution presented a thematic theory grounded in motive, opportunity, and demonstrated animus toward the decedent. That prosecutorial theory emphasized text messages and contemporaneous communications, the defendant's custodial role in the minutes prior to the child's collapse, and medical findings indicating blunt force trauma to the head and torso. Defense pleadings and courtroom positions, as recorded in courtroom broadcasts and local reporting, maintained challenges to elements of the state's case, pointed to alternative explanations presented during testimony, and asserted that certain charges carried overlapping legal elements requiring trial counsel and the court to engage in merger analysis at sentencing. The procedural posture that followed contained contested motions, live witness presentations, and the admission of forensic exhibits and medical records that jurors were tasked to evaluate against the statutory elements of malice murder, felony murder, aggravated battery, and cruelty to a child. The victim, identified in public reporting as Romeo J.D. Angelus, was 18 months old at the time of the incident and was present in a Georgia Southwestern State University dormitory room when the events transpired. The record reflects that the child was found unresponsive and transported to Phoebe Sumter Hospital where medical staff documented severe traumatic injuries, and despite medical intervention the child succumbed to the injuries. Prosecution filings and trial testimony presented to the jury described the child as a previously healthy toddler before the sudden collapse, and emergency responders, hospital clinicians, and forensic experts provided evidence regarding the child's injuries, contemporaneous observations of trauma, and chain of custody documentation for samples taken during the initial hospital evaluation. Those medical source materials formed the core factual basis for the criminal complaint and subsequent indictment, and the state's proof emphasized the timing of the father's temporary absence from the dormitory, the defendant's caretaking presence during that window, and the immediacy of the child's deterioration as critical evidentiary elements supporting culpability for the charged offenses. Public reporting introduced into the record communications and background facts the state offered to support motive and consciousness of guilt, including messages to third parties describing negative feelings about the child and an alleged desire to have a biological child with the child's father rather than to assume a parental role for the victim. Press accounts and courtroom exhibits referenced text messages and social media material that prosecutors used to contextualize the defendant's relationship with the victim's father and the interpersonal dynamics that preceded the incident. Defense counsel challenged in part the evidentiary weight of those communications, sought limiting instructions where appropriate, and questioned whether such materials constituted demonstrative proof of underlying intent as opposed to expressions of frustration. The juxtaposition of contemporaneous communications with physical injury evidence created a layered factual matrix for jurors to assess motive in light of forensic and medical testimony presented over multiple days of trial. The admissibility and probative value of the communications were addressed through cross-examination and foundational questioning that appear in broadcasted trial coverage and summarized news reports. Chronology presented at trial, as reconstructed from investigative reports and witness testimony summarized by media, positions the incident within a narrow temporal window. The father departed a dormitory room to retrieve food shortly before noon, leaving the toddler in the defendant's care. Within a short interval, the child's cries were reported by witnesses, followed by an abrupt cessation, culminating in a discovery of unresponsiveness and a 911 call that initiated emergency response and hospital transport. Investigators documented timestamps for interviews, medical intake forms, and video exhibits proffered at trial where available, and the state relied on that compressed sequence to argue an actionable time frame linking the defendant's custodial presence to the onset of severe injuries. Defense witnesses and cross-examination probed the exact timing, potential intervening events, and alternative mechanisms for injury, producing contested chronologies that the jury had to weigh against physical evidence, testimonial credibility assessments, and statutory burdens of proof required for each charged offense. Medical testimony admitted at trial described a constellation of injuries to the decedent, including intracranial hemorrhage, skull fractures, and internal trauma consistent with high-energy blunt force impact. Pathologists and treating physicians testified to observed clinical findings, imaging results, and the likely mechanisms necessary to produce the documented injuries, while also offering caveat opinions regarding timing of injury, survivability, and the limitations of retrospective causation analyses. Forensic clinicians in reporting and trial exhibits acknowledged inherent scientific constraints. Samples taken at autopsy or in hospital care can be degraded, partial markers may be present, and isolated findings are subject to interpretation, leading experts to couch some conclusions in probabilistic terms such as consistent with, suggestive of, or within a range of plausible mechanisms rather than offering a single deterministic account. Prosecutors nonetheless argued that the pattern and severity of injuries were inconsistent with a simple fall from bedding and met the evidentiary threshold for aggravated battery and felony murder under Georgia statutes. Following the initial medical response and hospital care, law enforcement investigative steps included interviews with the child's father, contemporaneous witnesses, roommates, and the defendant. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation joined inquiries at the request of local police, and multiple recorded interviews formed the basis for probable cause determinations and an eventual arrest. Investigators reported recovery and cataloging of physical evidence, the review of electronic devices for searches and communications, and coordination with medical personnel to reconcile clinical findings with reported histories. Public reporting indicates that the state's case incorporated both physical evidence and the defendant's recorded statements or actions after the discovery of unresponsiveness. Defense counsel contested some investigative inferences at trial, argued for alternative interpretations of the forensic record, and raised concerns about potential investigative omissions or evidentiary gaps, producing a contested record that centralized chain of custody, witness credibility, and the interpretive limits of forensic inference in the jury's deliberations. During trial, prosecution cross-examinations and witness presentations highlighted inconsistencies between initial explanations offered by the defendant and subsequent accounts or physical findings, with reporting noting that the defendant provided varying descriptions of how the child became unresponsive. Such discrepancies were presented as material to credibility assessments and as corroboration for the state's theory of concealment or misstatement, while the defense argued that stress, confusion, or misperception in emergency conditions could account for evolving statements. The factual record as reported also shows that counsel for both parties litigated the admissibility of prior statements, the contextual framing of earlier accounts, and whether certain deviations amounted to intentional falsehoods or understandable inconsistencies under duress. Jurors were instructed on the proper evaluation of witness statements and the permissive inferences that may or may not flow from inconsistent narratives under governing evidentiary rules. The prosecution's opening presented a chronological narrative linking motive, opportunity, and physical harm, supported by exhibits including medical records, photographs of injuries, and digital communications. Media-accessible courtroom feeds captured direct testimony from treating clinicians and lay witnesses, as well as cross-examination designed to test timelines and alternative explanations. Defense openings and witness presentations emphasized gaps in the state's proof, challenged the conclusiveness of certain forensic claims, and reminded jurors of the statutory presumption of innocence and the requirement that guilt be established beyond a reasonable doubt. The presence of live video coverage and contemporaneous reporting contributed to an extensive public record. However, televised snippets do not supplant the trial transcript or admissible exhibit content, and legal practitioners in the courtroom framed arguments around the precise statutory language for malice murder, felony murder predicated on aggravated battery, and the degrees of cruelty to a child under Georgia law. Jurors were presented with sequential witness testimony, demonstrative exhibits, and expert opinions that required assessment of technical medical concepts, credibility evaluations, and inferences from circumstantial evidence. Courtroom observers reported periods of extended silence during medical testimony and close note-taking during cross-examinations that delineated disputes over causation mechanisms and temporal sequencing. The trial record, as described by outlets that monitored proceedings, indicates that jurors received jury instructions clarifying elements of malice versus felony murder, the legal standards for aggravating physical injury, and the scope of permissible inferences from competing factual accounts. The deliberation process that followed required jurors to reconcile multi-source evidence, medical, testimonial, and electronic, while applying legal definitions and the burden of proof mandate, a task central to the mixed verdict ultimately returned in the matter. Broadcasted courtroom images and reporting documented the defendant's visible emotional reactions during verdict announcements and sentencing, and observers noted moments described in coverage as smiles, tears, or composure under pressure at different hearings. Such conduct was presented in news accounts without equating demeanor with culpability. While defense counsel cautioned against allowing observed behavior to substitute for evidentiary findings and reminded the court that courtroom effect is an unreliable metric for legal determinations. The prosecution relied on documentary and testimonial proof rather than behavioral inference, whereas the defense highlighted effective display as one component of mitigation at sentencing, an argument regularly made in post-conviction advocacy aimed at tempering judicial discretion within statutory sentencing ranges and merger determinations applicable to multiple convictions. Sentencing hearings and pre-sentencing conferences required the court to address merger principles and whether multiple aggravated battery counts would merge with felony murder counts given statutory and case law precedents. Counsel engaged in legal argument regarding which counts should survive as separate sentencing exposures and whether consecutive or concurrent terms were appropriate, with the court referencing precedent and the single-victim rule to resolve merger queries for final sentencing entry. The state urged imposition of a life term on the felony murder count with additional years for cruelty to children, while defense counsel urged concurrent sentencing and full consideration of mitigating circumstances. The judge's written and oral rulings on count merger and sentencing discretion, as recited in public coverage, guided the ultimate imposition of custodial terms and articulated the legal rationale for count selection. Closing arguments distilled the trial record into competing narratives. The prosecution portrayed motive, digital communications, and medical evidence as convergent indicators of intentional or reckless conduct meeting felony murder and aggravated battery standards, while the defense framed inconsistencies, scientific caveats, and potential innocent explanations as reasons to withhold the highest degrees of criminal culpability. Counsel for both sides referenced specific exhibits and witness testimony in efforts to anchor jurors' deliberations to discrete evidentiary parcels, and the court's jury instructions emphasized legal definitions that would govern the jury's application of facts to law. The record preserved in court transcripts and media summaries reflects that both parties emphasized the limitations of certain forms of proof, medical equivocation, partial samples, and inferential leaps, thereby leaving the jury to apply statutory elements against the mosaic of admissible facts. The jury returned a split verdict, acquittal on malice murder and guilty findings on 2 counts of felony murder, 2 counts of aggravated battery, and 1 count of first-degree cruelty to children, and the court proceeded to sentencing consistent with merger analysis and statutory sentencing ranges. The judge pronounced a life sentence on the felony murder count with an additional term for cruelty to children to run concurrently, and advised the defendant of appellate and post-conviction timelines available under Georgia procedure. In imposing sentence, the court referenced the evidence admitted at trial, the jury's factual findings, and the legal calculus governing merger between overlapping counts, and public reporting of the sentencing hearing captured both the sentence imposed and the judge's procedural admonitions regarding appeal periods and habeas corpus remedies. The sentencing entry, as reflected in broadcast summaries and local reporting, concluded the trial phase of the criminal matter while preserving appellate avenues that will examine legal rulings and evidentiary sufficiency. The jury returned a split verdict, acquittal on malice murder and guilty findings on 2 counts of felony murder, 2 counts of aggravated battery, and 1 count of first-degree cruelty to children, and the court proceeded to sentencing consistent with merger analysis and statutory sentencing ranges. The judge pronounced a life sentence on the felony murder count with an additional term for cruelty to children to run concurrently, and advised the defendant of appellate and post-conviction timelines available under Georgia procedure. In imposing sentence, the court referenced the evidence admitted at trial, the jury's factual findings, and the legal calculus governing merger between overlapping counts, and public reporting of the sentencing hearing captured both the sentence imposed and the judge's procedural admonitions regarding appeal periods and habeas corpus remedies. The sentencing entry, as reflected in broadcast summaries and local reporting, concluded the trial phase of the criminal matter while preserving appellate avenues that will examine legal rulings and evidentiary sufficiency.